Good afternoon. This is Susan Eisenhower from the Eisenhower Institute. Welcome to EI Live, a series of interviews that the Eisenhower Institute is hosting for our students, our faculty, our community, and for the world at large. We love this opportunity to be with you, and especially on this occasion where we are going to be marking the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. You know, I must say that we're very, very fortunate to have a wonderful speaker with us today, Colonel Leonard Fullenkamp. But before I introduce Colonel Fullenkamp, I'd like to just say that it's with some nostalgia that today, as we think about Victory in Europe Day, I feel rather sad that we are deprived of the opportunity to celebrate this anniversary properly. It's the 75th anniversary of the greatest, most destructive war in history, at least in the European theater, and we'll of course celebrate the end of World War II later this year. But the European campaign was particularly poignant. It was the largest of our operations, and of course I have a family tie to these events. In any case, it is such an enormous treat for me to introduce Colonel Leonard Fullenkamp, one of the world's leading experts on World War II and the European campaign. Colonel Fullenkamp has been an extraordinary scholar of military strategy and history, and he comes to us from his position at the Army War College in Carlisle, where he served in two positions as the Henry L. Stimson Chair of Military Studies and also the Military History and Strategy program, where he held the General Dwight D. Eisenhower Chair in National Security. And so he's extraordinarily well-versed in all of these subjects we're going to discuss today, but also an expert on other battles, other wars. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Colonel Fullenkamp. Len, if I may call you that, we've been colleagues for many years, and I should also add that it's been an enormous pleasure, and I know really a life-changing experience for my students in strategy and leadership in transformational times to go with me and Colonel Fullenkamp to the beaches of Normandy. So welcome, and thank you for
Susan.
taking this time from your schedule.
Thank you. Well, I'm flattered to be asked, and I'm delighted to be here. And thank you for that very, very generous introduction.
Well, don't you feel a little sense of sadness that we can't mark this anniversary in a proper way? 75 years is one of those iconic numbers. I guess they happen every 25 years. And it's probably the last big anniversary that our veterans will be able to experience. So tell me, Len, how do you think about why it's important to step back during this holiday? It's a holiday in my mind. Actually, I said it's one filled with sadness, but for me, it's also filled with joy. And why do you think it's important to step back and actually mark this anniversary?
Well, to start with, both of us probably had an opportunity last summer. I know I did, and I believe you were there as well. We went to Normandy, where they celebrated, or they commemorated the 71st anniversary of D-Day. And we were in the cemetery when President Trump and President Macron spoke, along with the 106 veterans of World War II who were there.
Right. And
had the opportunity over the course of that ceremony and afterwards to meet several of them and to realize that the past is not really the past. Those were living veterans who had experienced those great events. And then in December, I was in the Ardennes at Bastogne for the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge in the middle of December. And again, had an opportunity to meet the veterans. And I was struck by conversations with veterans who very humbly would take the compliments that we paid to them as the greatest generation with often words such as, well, I just did my job, or everyone was doing it, or it was what had to be done at the time. And looking back on the war from 75 years, what we should be thinking about today is the sacrifices that generation made, the extraordinary things that they did. When you think about what the country was like back in 1941, when we got into the war, coming off the years of the Great Depression, 130 million Americans, an army of about 139,000, maybe upwards of 170,000 total, plus some National Guard. And in 6 years, that country, that great country, shook itself. 16 million Americans stood to arms and joined the forces that fought in that war. And we built an army. George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower built and fought an army out of whole cloth. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. And what we as Americans should be thinking about today is what this country was able to do when there was a perceived need, a clear perceived need to confront National Socialism, to confront fascism. And we were able to do that. We were able to marshal those efforts and bring the resources of the country to bear. That in today's times, when we talk about what we're going through now with the coronavirus and other sorts of issues as regards to the role that the United States plays in the world today, that's been since the Second World War, that role has evolved. And we thought our role had come to an end in 1990 when the Soviet Union sort of went away. It wasn't going away. That role was simply changing. It was being transformed. But we are yet to put our finger on it in a way that we can convey to the American people the importance of what needs to be done. And as a result, an event like the 75th anniversary of VE Day can focus people's minds on what it is we did. And then if they're skillful enough, our leaders can make that transition to, and here's what we need to be doing today with the sacrifice and with the contribution and the brilliance of the people who were called upon to serve.
I know, it's a remarkable thing. It really gives the word scale up new meaning, doesn't it? What they did going into that war. It's rather extraordinary too. I'd like your thoughts about this. It's remarkable that Adolf Hitler actually declared war on the United States. Now, talk about strategy. That would strike me as one of the bigger mistakes of the 20th century. Did he understand what we perceive to be at stake? Do you think he? No. Okay.
No.
What was the mistake, Len?
Well, without going through Adolf Hitler's complete rise to power, he states very clearly in Mein Kampf what his goals were. That was to grab living space for Germany, to right what he thought were the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles and so forth. To do that, he had to conquer territory, and that territory lay primarily to the east, but then the west he knew would be a problem, so you had to deal with that as well. His analysis of the perception of the threat posed by the United States, in spite of what happened in the First World War and the contribution of the United States, he really had never traveled outside of a small orbit of a few countries, Austria, Germany, and therefore didn't really understand the latent power of the United States, the resources that it could bring to bear. And he did not surround himself with people who could advise him on that. And so when he was stitching together his alliance, or the Axis alliance with Italy and then ultimately Japan, when he almost casually made an agreement. I just reread William Shirer's book, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And Shirer makes a very clear point. He said that Hitler almost absent-mindedly on the 11th of December declared war on the United States because, well, he had promised Japan that he would fight alongside them. And Japan had never extracted that promise. He just freely gave it. And he saw when Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, he saw that what he hoped would be Japan pulling forces from the United States toward the Pacific. And therefore, for him, it was a no cost, in Shirer's opinion, and I happen to agree with that, was a no cost thing to declare war on the United States because in his view, and remember at this time in December of 1941, he thought that the war in Russia was going favorably. Yes, they were stopped a mere 18 miles from the Kremlin, but with the spring, he thought that would easily be fallen and or taken, and then he could turn to other pursuits. So it's almost hard to overstate what an error in strategic judgment it was, and as to why he would have so carelessly brought upon himself a war that brought the United States into it.
I'd like to follow up on that. Is there any possibility that it never occurred to him that when the United States developed its strategy for World War II, it was going to decide to do Europe first, even though we had been attacked initially by the Japanese?
Well, let me answer that second. The first thing that occurs to me was when Hitler saw the United States come into the war, he wasn't worried. Our army was somewhere between the 14th and 15th largest in the world. We're somewhere behind Romania as far as our capabilities. We don't really have an air force to speak of. We do have a big Navy, but that is likely to be tied up in the Pacific. So arguably, if you think you're going to win wars quickly, and most people who go to war think they're going to be short, sharp, and decisive, you could see where he would say, I am going to go to war quickly, and by the time the United States comes along, I'll be more than ready to deal with him. So he looked at 5 to 7 years it would take us to spin up to be ready to go. He had absolutely no concept of how quickly we were able to build an army, for example. Winston Churchill, when he came over and made a tour of the United States early in 42, or they took him to South Carolina and showed him a training exercise. And Churchill was just sort of stunned at how quickly the United States seemed to be pulling together forces. We went from that 175,000 or so in 1979 to several million by 41, and ultimately over 8 million, 8.3 million in round numbers in the Army and the Army Air Corps by 1945. So the speed with which we were able to do that is what confused Hitler. And then the Germany first kind of thing, or in the Atlantic Charter, which Churchill and Roosevelt put together in 1940, leads, I mean, it's published knowledge that if there's a fight, it's probably going to be with the European threat first. And the reason for that was, even if you're an amateur strategist, that if you don't deal with Germany, ultimately you're going to have to deal with them anyway. So even if you turn to Japan first, that German problem is still there. And it may be worse, because if Germany is successful, then you're going to lose England or potentially Russia. And you can't afford to lose either one of those two. So our strategy sort of evolves behind the Germany first decision, but our leaders have to be given credit. Both Roosevelt, Marshall, King, Arnold, Leahy, our joint chiefs, and the British joint chiefs and Churchill, for realizing that we had to stick with it. You know, it's one thing to come up with a good idea. It's another thing not to be dissuaded from the good idea, because there's always competition. You know, Eisenhower said one time, he was asked by Drew Middleton, what's the most difficult thing you do as a general? And he asked him that question several times, but one of the times he asked him the question, Ike said, is knowing when to change the plan, because the plan is the plan. It's carefully arrived at. It's the result of the distillation of the best ideas you have. And because it's not working yet, the pressure is enormous to change. And our leaders, both here and in the alliance, stayed the course. And that's a remarkable thing, because there were some dark, dark days.
Well, there were, and I think that one of the striking things about it is there were a couple of things that were going on in addition to meeting this challenge. First of all, there was an alliance that was being put together, a complicated alliance that encompassed the United States and Great Britain primarily, who actually saw strategy in quite a different way. And then you have, along with that, differing ideas about which parts of Europe should be the first to meet our forces. Obviously we were involved already in Africa, but it was a complex thing. And I think we tend to think that that successful alliance during the war was always going to be successful. that the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain was always going to be special. How do you look at the difficulty of that alliance, especially in the context eventually of a integrated, unified command?
So I'm resisting the impulse here to try to tell you how to build a watch. But if you go back and take a look at what the United States was doing during the 30s, we were an isolationist country. We were not going to get involved again in a European war. There were a lot of Americans who were so adamant in our political leadership that we passed these isolationist laws that said we're just not going to get involved. And then when the war came, President Roosevelt, in his great wisdom, started a dialogue with Winston Churchill that said, tell me what you need, let me know how you're doing, I'd like to hear from you from time to time. And from that first humble beginning becomes this relationship, first a personal relationship, which ultimately is going to mature into an international relationship. The United States and Great Britain are going to be allies in this endeavor. And when Hitler decides he's going to attack Russia, now communism during the 30s was a problem for the United States, because in that time of the Great Depression, the idea of communism and the ideology of communism attracted many adherents. And as a result, when Hitler attacked Russia, and Winston Churchill says, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Churchill was an ardent anti-communist all during the 30s. And he was challenged for his willingness to now embrace Russia in this fight. And Churchill said, look, you know, if Hitler invaded hell tomorrow, I'd have to get up in the House of Commons and say something nice about the devil, because it was so important that we defeat National Socialism. So the three of them, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, formed this alliance. Now, you know, there's a lot of people today who sort of cast aspersions on alliances because they tend to be permanent agreements, more durable than just ad hoc coalitions. Coalitions are just temporary kinds of things. You sign on the alliance, you make agreements, and we did that. And we did that with the idea in mind that we had to keep Russia in the war in the beginning, because Great Britain was an island and it had lost its army at Dunkirk. It had a navy and it had an air force, but it wasn't prepared to go meet the Germans on the continent. The United States was not yet ready. So who was going to fight the Germans until we were ready to go? And it had to be Russia. And in 1917, Russia had been an ally to France and Great Britain during the First World War, but they made a separate peace in the fall of 1917. And the great fear was on the part of Churchill and Roosevelt that would happen again. And so it had to be clear to Stalin that no separate peace would be made, that this alliance was going to be firm. And, you know, there were a lot of people who said that Joe Stalin's got a lot of blood on his hands, which was true. But the stakes were so great that it was determined that we're going to stick with this ally.
Yeah.
And then in January of 43, when they came up with unconditional surrender, that was yet another way. Bad strategy, but perhaps good diplomacy.
Yeah, well, of course, the Soviet Union, after they took an enormous number of losses, started putting pressure on us to open a second front. And it's rather ironic, I think, that it was Joseph Stalin who kept pressing for the name of the person who is going to be supreme commander of this operation and the opening of a Western Front. It's an interesting way for Dwight Eisenhower had already been commanding forces in North Africa and Sicily, that suddenly he would be tapped for this particular job. There's a great story behind that, isn't there?
Well, there is. You see, the second front, from the beginning, Russia, as soon as Churchill says, okay, we're going to be in this alliance and we're going to help you, and Roosevelt said yes, and we're going to give you Lend-Lease as well, Stalin said, where's my second front? And basically England and the United States said, we'll get to you. Now, remember, our espoused strategy was going to be Germany first, but the question is, where if we're going from England, which was going to basically be the launching platform, to Europe, where is Germany first? Where do you go first? And we end up going into North Africa because, well, there was a need. You know, we were trying to keep the Mediterranean open. The Brits had a great interest in all of that. And then to Stalin, that's not a second front. And then we finally wrap up the things in North Africa by May of 43, when the German and Italian forces are defeated there in Tunisia in May of 43. And Stalin says, and now, no, not quite yet. We jump to Sicily, and then we jump to Italy. Now, for us, what we're doing is, if you're Winston Churchill, is you are following the correct strategic line. You are attacking Germany from the south up through what he said was the soft underbelly. And that term is often used pejoratively, but there is an argument that could be made that is an avenue of approach. And it also covers Egypt, the Suez Canal, the routes to the east, or to the west rather, or to the oil fields and so forth. But the Americans, and especially George Marshall, from the beginning, argued as early as the spring of 1942 that the only way to go to Germany is across the channel directly on a line towards Berlin, the direct approach. And that gets at this thing called strategic culture. And we used to talk about this at the War College all the time. Is there such a thing as strategic culture? And I believe there is. Your strategic culture, or how you think about strategy, is sort of rooted in who you are and what you have. And the United States, for example, because we have vast resources and deep pockets, we sort of take a lesson from Ulysses S. Grant and the American Civil War, which is, when you go to war, you make war. You find the enemy, you press the attack, and you crush your opponent. Great Britain, who comes out of a less well-endowed culture, manpower, resources, etc., favors an approach more indirect. In fact, Liddell Hart wrote a book after the First World War about the indirect strategy, so that you don't put force against force, you put force against weakness. That's a great tactic. Even at the operational level, it makes sense. Doesn't always make sense at strategic level. At the strategic level, you sort of have to figure out, Elliot Cohen calls it his, what's your theory of victory? If this, then that. And for the United States, our theory of victory was build up a force in England, put it across the channel, drive into the heart of Germany, and destroy Germany's armed forces. That's a theory of victory. And you can see where certain American generals, Marshall and Eisenhower, said, this southern route doesn't really get to and temporizes, and that's where Joe Stalin comes in. Joe Stalin says,
doesn't get to Berlin, does it? No.
Well, maybe you would have gotten there, but Stalin wanted a more direct, and it's always amazing to me how many Americans just don't really appreciate how much of a contribution the Soviet Union made to the Second World War.
This is very true. I've experienced that. I once ran a little quiz for a group I was speaking to, and most people thought that the Soviet Union was our enemy during World War II. They kind of got that mixed up with the Cold War, and we'll get to the question about why history is important in a minute. But you're talking about so many momentous decisions and so many moving parts, you might say, that clearly in those cases, leadership makes an enormous difference. So how would you look at the leaders of the time, and how would you characterize them?
So the first and most important, I think, military leader that the United States produced in the Second World War was George Marshall. George Marshall was an incredible, towering figure. He, without going into much of his history, he is made Chief of Staff of the Army, the senior military person in the Army, on the 1st of September, 1939, the very day preceding Hitler's invasion of Poland. When Marshall comes to power, he realizes that we're going to need talent, and a lot of talent. And he's got this little black book, and he's had experience in various schools where he's met a number of leaders. And he's got a pretty good idea of who he thinks the leaders who are going to emerge are. And many of them do. People like Joe Collins and George Patton and Mark Clark and others, and Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower had come to his attention several times. Once, early in the 20s, when Eisenhower was working on Pershing's Battlefield Monuments book, Marshall was asked to read one of the things that Eisenhower wrote and gave him some advice and was aware of him. But then Eisenhower goes off on a track and gets hooked up with Douglas MacArthur, serves in MacArthur's office when MacArthur was Chief of Staff of the Army, and then is sent out or carried out to the Pacific, to the Philippines with Marshall, or with MacArthur. Meanwhile, Marshall becomes the Chief of Staff of the Army, and in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, he turns to Mark Clark and he says, "I've got to replace one of the key officers in my War Plans division. That's going to become a very important part of the War Department leadership. And give me a list of 10 names of who I should bring in to fill this important role." And Mark Clark said, "Well, I'll give you a list with Eisenhower's name written 10 times, because that's the guy I think who is really important, who can do what it is you want to do." General Eisenhower is brought into the War Plans division, starts to work under George Marshall, and Marshall realizes right away, this is an individual. I say that right away, but it truly was. He comes into Marshall's office and had recalled that he had met Marshall several times, but there really wasn't a relationship there. And Marshall says, "We got the problem in the Philippines. The fleet's been destroyed at Pearl Harbor. We got all those people out there in the Philippines. Our war plan for the relief of the Philippines is now inoperative. What are we going to do?" And Eisenhower very shrewdly says, "Give me a moment to think about that. Let me prepare something and I'll come back." So Eisenhower goes off, writes a memorandum, very well thought out, that basically comes in and says, really, there's nothing we can do. They're going to ultimately be lost. However, the country would never forgive us if we don't try to save them. And so that's what we should do. Marshall said, "My idea exactly. Let's try to do it." Well, of course, we are not successful. The Philippines go down, but I think that was a seminal moment, because in that moment, Marshall saw in Eisenhower a way of thinking, a resolution, a perspective. That's one of the things you have to have as a leader, that you have to have a perspective of not only what's possible, but what should be possible, even if it's not, because there are downstream ramifications to that, political ramifications, psychological.
And expectations too.
Exactly. And at one part, when Marshall was being interviewed by Forrest Hogue, one of his who ultimately was his biographer, Marshall indicated he had this understanding of how there was a dimension to war that was sort of beyond logic, that got into the realm of emotion. The needs of the people have to be sustained. Their support has to be sustained, which sometimes calls for sacrifices. And Eisenhower conveyed a sense of understanding that. So General Marshall is going to be key in selecting individuals. Now, once having selected individuals and put them in positions of great responsibility, he gives them a free rein, pretty much a free rein. It's not like hands off completely, but there is a dynamic relationship. And so Marshall chooses Eisenhower. Eisenhower, in turn, has a say over what subordinates he has. And he ultimately, Bradley will come to him. Omar Bradley will become a very important subordinate to Eisenhower. Marshall suggests him. Marshall's not unerring in his estimates. He does make some mistakes, but more often than not, he is correct. And more often than not, Eisenhower is able to use that talent that's provided to him. And the United States produced some very good Army commanders and Army group commanders.
Stayed with us a long time, actually, into the Korean War and on.
Yes, and what I think about is that those leaders had never served at these higher levels of responsibility. One of the authors on World War II and I were talking one time, and he sort of casually mentioned that Bradley was out of his depth. And I said, well, they were all out of their depth. I mean, you think about it. Joe Collins, who was an extraordinary corps commander in Normandy and through the end of the war, was a major on the onset of the war. And Bradley had just made his 1 star, and Eisenhower had just gotten his 1 star. And people like Lucian Truscott starts as a colonel and then quickly moves up, and Mark Clark the same way. They were all learning on the job. And so it's not surprising that they make mistakes sometimes, or it's not surprising that sometimes they are castigated by by historians for being too timid or not bold enough. You know, it's an enormous responsibility they had, and they saw every day the costs of mistakes, and they knew that mistakes would be made, but the war had to be prosecuted. And so,
well, the other thing is that you can't be cavalier about a human life on all kinds of levels, but they knew it was going to be a long war. They had to make sure that they use their assets in a wise way. So caution is not surprising. Certain British generals were also accused of being cautious too, weren't they, by the time this was all over? Len, you know, looking back on these extraordinary leaders, and especially people who scaled things up very quickly, learned on the job, all of the things you just mentioned, this is a little far removed in some ways from undergraduate students, and yet leadership is going on at all levels, from the very top all the way down through the ranks to even soldiers who are the age of our undergraduate students. How do you look at this set of engagements and think about the lessons for undergraduate students?
Well, let me give you a simple one that is easy to say and hard to do. You know, we like to say, for ease of discussion, that strategy is the calculated relationship of ends and means. And when I ask the question of Army colonels or young college students, what drives strategy? Is it ends or means? Almost reflexively, people say, well, means drive strategy. You can do all that is that you have the wherewithal to do. But that's the wrong answer. During the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln starts the war with no army and no money in the treasury. And eventually he's going to build a massive army and spend enormous sums of money. Why? Because for Lincoln, ends drive strategy. You develop or find the wherewithal, either by mining your own resources, or in the case of World War II, forming alliances. So what we did correctly in the Second World War is we came up with a strategy that we would fight National Socialism and fascism and deal with the Japanese. And we would do it in sort of a 1-2 way. And then we would find the resources to build the forces and then apply the forces to the problem. So ends drove strategy, not means. We found the means. Now, means are not inexhaustible. So it's not a simple math problem of I need this much to get there. That's where the ways part comes in. If I think I need so much and I only can get so much, that delta I can satisfy by forming alliances, by my battlefield strategy, my military strategy. Military strategy sometimes says, if I try to do the hard thing first, I'm not prepared for that. So I'm going to temporize until I'm able to do the hard thing. And whether Winston Churchill had thought this out clearly or whether Franklin Roosevelt could see over the horizon, that's basically what we did. We fight our way through North Africa, up through Sicily and into Italy, eventually knocking Italy out of the war in the summer of 43. But in the process, we're building our forces, building equipment, cultivating leaders. You know, this development of leaders is a winnowing process. You use a leader, and then if that leader rises to the occasion, you keep them. And if not, you move on to someplace else. And so we actually, and eventually, anybody who's really serious about World War II will tell you that the only reason that we said we wanted to do an invasion of cross channel in 1942 was if there was a sudden collapse of the Soviet Union, then we would have had to do that.
Right.
Next best, we pushed for 43 because we thought we would be ready by 43. But when we made a decision, and it was really Roosevelt's call, that we support Churchill in North Africa, when we decided to go into North Africa in November of 42, then we deferred actually to the spring of 44, the idea that we could do Overlord. But think about this. General Eisenhower, as a 1-star, comes into the War Plans Division. In June of 42, he goes to England as a 2-star, basically a placeholder to wait until Marshall's ready to come over and assume command. But in the interim, the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch comes up. Eisenhower does Torch. And he learns that, there's a big delta between what we want to do and what we're able to do. And he also used those, experience is only beneficial if you learn from it. Good judgment is a result of bad experiences, and bad experiences can lead to good judgment, providing that there's some sort of dynamic relationship. And Eisenhower examines his own performance in these operations by writing memorandums, which are in his correspondence, his wartime correspondence. What we wanted to do? How well did we do it? What did we anticipate? What didn't we anticipate? What he's trying to do, and after the fact, he goes back and grades his papers. What he's trying to do is educate his mind. And then when he does the Sicily operation after North Africa, again, what do we think was good? What was not going to be good? And he's also learning one of the most important things he learns as a commander, as a leader during the Second World War. That's leadership in an alliance or in a coalition force. It's one thing if you have a single nationality that you're leading. Everybody sort of talks the same way and understands the same doctrine and is on the same page, has the same national interests. But when you get into an alliance, we say a lot of bad things about Hitler as a strategist, but one of the things Hitler almost had right was he just never believed that this Frankenstein coalition or alliance of Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union could hang together. He always believed that it would fall apart. And it's a tribute to the leadership, not only the political leadership, but the military leadership of the Second World War, that they were able to hold that together. So Eisenhower learns. By the time Eisenhower is tapped to be the commander for Overlord, he had the experiences of North Africa, which were a growing learning process. He had done the major amphibious operation, the landing in Sicily in July of 43. He had supervised the landings at Salerno in September of 43. And he had done the preliminary planning for the invasion at Anzio. So he was as experienced at that high level as a commander, but also as an alliance commander. And one of the things that Drew Middleton, who wrote several books, was a correspondent for the New York Times and other papers during the Second World War, said about Eisenhower was, when asked what made Eisenhower an effective commander, Middleton said was Eisenhower's reasonableness. He would listen to an alternative point of view or an alliance point of view, and he would, when he could, he would adjust his own position, because he understood that individual nationalities have national interests. Even in an alliance, they have national interests. And what you're trying to do in an alliance is to harmonize to the best of your ability the national interests with the overall alliance interests. That is PhD kind of military strategy at its best.
Well, and you think about how complex that was with the personalities, and then how complex it was to be putting together a unified command for the first time in military history, an integrated command, and then to be doing that against the backdrop of scaling up all of the resources necessary to carry forward the fight. I mean, it's really a complex but absolutely fascinating story. So undergraduates, I think there's some real lessons there. I think what I take from what you've said is that they really should be understanding that the years of preparation need to be ones of self-examination, about trying to improve upon performance every time, and maybe also to have confidence that you can do things that you didn't know you could do.
Yes, and learning to listen.
And learning to
really listen to the other side's point of view, and consider the possibility that they may be onto something that you hadn't thought about.
Len, what's interesting for me, I just wrote this book, How Ike Led, and it encompasses both the war and his presidency. But it's interesting how Ike took the same staff situation to the White House with him. One gruff, tough chief of staff, and then lots of people around him with differing viewpoints. I think I've made that point before, but it's back to taking the lessons you learn along the way and sorting out the good ones from the bad ones. There are so many questions that everybody has. Maybe we could take a moment for a few that have come in. Um, one of the questions that came in, which is sort of in keeping with what we've been discussing, and so maybe this gives us an opportunity to kind of wrap up some of these thoughts. Our questioner says, as we get further from the war, how should we continue to remember the lessons of that conflict? What are the enduring things that stay with us about the European theater?
So whenever I hear the term lessons, I'm always hesitant, because a lesson appears to be something that you write down or that you can look up, or that is a sort of a prescription.
Right.
This bad happened, so don't do that the next time. That's a prescription. And I prefer to use the term insights. And when I think about what insights can be drawn from the study of our experiences in the Second World War, I think about an admonition that was put to me once in my own education. And that is, the professor said, my goal is not to make you clever. My goal is to make you wise. If you're just simply going to be clever, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a number of examples where this was done in response to that. And you'll put that lesson, that insight, call it what you will, in your kit bag. So the next time you see that, you'll say, oh, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do what they did then. But you know, the future has a nasty habit of being surprising and different. And so there are never going to be enough lessons or insights for you to deal as a responsible leader with the future. So we don't want to make you clever when you think about the war. We want you to be wise. And so when I study the Second World War or lead people in that process, what I want them to do is to think about what it is they saw happen. What were the possibilities that were available to the decision makers? Why did they decide as they decided? Why did we choose to go here as opposed to there? Eisenhower, when he's planning his battle, how I'm going to fight my way across Europe, has a choice. He can do, as Montgomery wanted to do, a concentrated single thrust toward the heart of Germany. After all, we're trying to get there. And so give everything to me, says Monty, and let's go directly, the most direct approach. Mass is one of those, one of the principles of war that come out of the First World War. One of the most sacred principles is mass. Concentrate your combat power at the decisive place and time. And General Eisenhower comes up with this idea, no, we're going to have a broad front strategy. We're going to move all the armies across the continent at the same time. And this is roundly criticized as violating mass. It doesn't go directly to the heart of the matter. But General Eisenhower is trying to fight a coalition or an alliance war. He's trying to keep the Americans and the British fighting at the same time. He wants to keep the opponent off balance, not give the opponent something he can fight and concentrate against, but give him a multitude of problems to deal with. And so for a lot of reasons, Eisenhower comes up with this idea of a broad front strategy, and that's what he pursues. Now, the Monday morning quarterbacks ceaselessly examine that and determine whether or not it's the right thing to do. And for the moment, set that aside and ask yourself the question, if you were confronted with a similar problem where you could put everything on one roll of the dice or maybe hedge your bets, what is the argument for each one of those courses of action? Why do you decide the way you decide? What information do you need to know to make the decisions you're going to need to make?
Oh, exactly.
Because more often than not, we have the paralysis of analysis. There are so many things that we could do that let's not do anything. Let's wait and see what develops. That wait and see what develops is a very powerful a thought that often comes into the minds of people who think about problem solving. There's two things wrong with that, in my view, or at least considered. One is, if you wait to see what's developing, you're playing defense rather than offense. In other words, you don't have the initiative, you're ceding the initiative. And the other thing is unless you have a clear statement of where it is you're trying to go and what it is you're trying to do, your subordinates are basically paralyzed. They are not empowered to act because they don't know where it is you're going to go. So when we study that war in all its complexity, you can look at any one of three levels. You can deal with strategy at the highest level. How does what it is we're trying to do support the political objectives? Or you can get down to the lowest level, at the tactical level, where you're dealing with a particular problem. Just remember this, that at the lowest level, the tactical level, there's an axiom in the Army that goes like this: we never give a mission without giving resources. So when you give a tactical leader a mission, the assumption is, correctly, that he's been given the wherewithal to do what it is we're asking him to do. The higher up you go, the less valid that assumption becomes, because at the operational level, your goals become aspirational, just as they do at the highest strategic level. You can never allow failure to occur at the strategic level, because that could be irreversible. Whereas at the lower level, if we fail gallantly at the tactical level, then we can recover that.
Well, you know, one of the other complexities, I'll just make this brief because we've got another question here, but these Monday morning quarterbacks, continue to debate this if you want to. We have all the information now. The war is over. We've been in everybody's archives. We know who now was thinking what. But the thing that made the war so complex and actually fascinating is what information people had and when they had it. So many of these big decisions were being made without having a full picture at all of what was going on the other side, what was even going on in, various parts of the terrain and the battlefield. So this Monday morning quarterbacking is just fine, but that's what makes the study of the war so fascinating for me, is the complexity and actually the courage it took to make decisions based on limited information. We have another question here. Thank you for that wonderful, I'm going to always remember that, Len, about not lessons, but insights, because those are things that can be readjusted for current times, can't they? And so this question is about current times, actually. Our questioner wants to ask about the coronavirus and says that this virus crisis has caused countries to look in at their own nation and to resist global cooperation. Do you think we'll see a rise in fascism, nationalism, as we did in the 30s and 40s? And what will that look like? And how can we move back towards a globalized world? So I guess the question really revolves around whether we see any parallels between that period and what's happening today. And then if I may just add on an additional question to that, how would we compare how we're organized today with the way we organized ourselves after it was clear that we were going to war?
Well, it's the parallels. First of all, I'm in favor of a unilateral, or rather a multilateral approach to problem solving in a global situation. You know, globalism has gotten a bad name of late, and neo-isolationism has come back into vogue in some respects. But you know, it's a connected world. Whenever I think about multilateralism, or I think about globalization, or I am not for global government, but I am for if we're thinking about cooperation in a way that looks like this. Think of the salad as opposed to the smoothie. You know, when you make a smoothie in the morning, you throw in the bananas, the blueberries, and all those other things and hit the blender, and you got this kind of smoothie. But when you make a salad, you got radishes and carrots and lettuce and cucumbers and olives, etc. Each one of those are individual distinct entities, but collectively they make a pretty good meal, that salad. That's the way I think about global cooperation. It's hard. It's very hard because national interests are always present, and there's always competing demands of national resources for domestic requirements. And the first and most important responsibility of a government is to take care of its own people. But this virus knows no borders, and our response to it must acknowledge that we're all in the boat together, and the survival of any particular one of us at the expense of the others doesn't really produce a good outcome. So I think we're getting there. In the beginning, it was quite natural for because of the specter of the unknown and the deadliness of this foe that we're facing. It was natural for us to sort of reflexively look inward, but to solve the problem ultimately, we're going to have to deal with it globally, and we have various fora that are able to do that. We just need to kind of get those moving, and by fits and starts. I always in times like this, I always harken back to Churchill's supposed quip about you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else first. So we're kind of working through here some alternatives, hopefully, and I am hopeful that we're going to get to it where we're going to come up with more of a global response.
I must say that the one thing that's annoying me at the moment, though, is all of this reference to war. We're in the middle of a war. We have a wartime environment. We have our leaders are wartime leaders, at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. The reason I don't like that is, first of all, we have said that we're in wars against all sorts of things that don't have people on the other side. And real warfare, like World War II, was really about a kind of a match of brain power, economic power, mobility, and psychology. I mean, there was a big psychological piece to this war, back to the emotionalism you're talking about before, and all of those other, Dwight Eisenhower called them human problems, all the other things that go with being a human being. We don't have psychological considerations with respect to our quote unquote enemy in the coronavirus war. We have only our own national psychological profile to be concerned about. And in this, I certainly don't blame anybody for looking for a rallying point, but the psychological threat comes from within here rather than the complexities of figuring out what your enemy on the other side might have thought during World War II. In any case, we're always grasping for direct parallels, and it's not always very satisfying. I wonder, are you still in touch with a number of veterans? I thought maybe before we close, you and I might reflect on how fortunate we've been in our professional careers to spend a lot of time with people who actually fought that war. We had an opportunity to talk to people about the kind of courage they had to summon, even though they're not saying that about themselves. We just know they had to have it. What brings you back to those battlefields in Europe? What has compelled you, sort of on a final note? I'd love to know, and for as long as we've known each other, I've never actually asked you that.
Thank you for asking that, because one of the things that I was struck with when I started to read about the Second World War was the archetypes or the role models that the World War II leaders looked to. They looked to the Civil War, and the Civil War was about 80 years in the past at the time of the Second World War. And so Patton, who had ancestors who fought in that war, and Dwight Eisenhower, who knew Civil War veterans because in his youth they were everywhere. Yeah. And so who did you study? You studied people like Lee and Grant, and Eisenhower very famously has this picture of Lee on his office wall. And it's a side story, but when there were criticisms of Lee, Eisenhower was very much a defender of Lee, which in today's parlance is perhaps politically incorrect, but nevertheless it was the case. So the World War II generation looked to the Civil War. So I think it was natural for my generation and the Vietnam generation I talk here about. We didn't look to World War I for leaders or Korean War. Right. The people we looked to was the Second World War. And there were bigger than life individuals. There were Bradley and Eisenhower and Patton and others. And when I taught history at West Point years ago, we would get into this discussion about leadership and styles of leadership. And I use this example with cadets. I would say, as you think about what kind of leader you're going to be and how you're going to lead, and you're going to read about some of the great leaders of World War II, and what you need to think about leadership styles as if it was a suit of clothes. The leadership style is a suit of clothes. And if you go into the store and you say that patent suit there really looks great, I want to try that on, and you put it on and it's baggy and it's rumpled and it doesn't make you look good, but that Omar Bradley suit, which doesn't look so good on the rack, fits you to a T. Or the Eisenhowers or whatever. Whatever leadership style you think you want to adopt, it has to be compatible with who you are, because you're not going to, if you're not true to yourself. And so as you study these World War II leaders, I studied them. I began to look for who was it that that appealed to me. And almost right away, two people, Marshall and Eisenhower, kept coming back. And a lot of my colleagues, and I served in Ranger battalions and parachute units and all those kinds of knuckle dragging outfits, and they would say, you know, those are not fighters. They're administrators. They're chairman of the board types. I said, well, yes and no. You know, even Clausewitz said the maximum application of force doesn't obviate the use of the intellect. You know, that has to be brought to bear as well. So I began to look at how these men, Eisenhower in particular, I had an opportunity to pick up a set of Eisenhower's wartime correspondence for about $35 years ago, 5 volumes, World War II correspondence.
Wow.
I read those books cover to cover, page. I have them on my shelf today, and they're typically they're filled with notes, each one. And each one of those notes address a particular kind of situation that Eisenhower had to deal with. And what's so fascinating about reading correspondence to help you think about how you would deal with the situation is when you read that correspondence, what's on the left-hand side of the page is the problem. What's on the right-hand side of the page is going to be what he did about it. But when he wrote the left-hand side, he didn't know what was going to be on the right-hand side. And you have an opportunity to see how they think. And you also polish your own humility, because you see them polish their own humility. You know, one of the most difficult things for you to do in any situation is to say, I was wrong about that. I'm going to do something different the next time for these reasons. And if you can't be honest with yourself, you're never going to be honest with anybody else. And that to me is what I get from studying these World War II leaders. Now, the battlefields are the rest of the story. You know, you can sit in your room and you can read about a campaign. You can read about the Overlord operation, but until you stand at Plymouth and look across the English Channel and realize that's a long way, that's 100 miles over there, or make that trip across the Channel and then get on the ground and go through Normandy and look at those. There aren't many pieces of the bocage left, but they are there. And suddenly you realize that, you know, the great Field Marshal Slim said that all military operations take place at night in the rain, going up the hill at the junction of 2 or more map sheets. What that speaks to is the uncertainty, the complexity, if all the facts are clear, you do what the facts say to do. It's when you don't have the facts and you have to do that you really find out what leadership is all about. Yeah.
Actually, that's very moving. I know exactly what you're saying. We have been so fortunate as an institution to have you with us in Normandy. I know I hear from the students who went on those trips all the time, and they write me just out of the blue some days and say, I was thinking about Omaha Beach today, and it helped me get through something. You know, I find it very moving. It's just great. So, listen, Len, I want to thank you very much. I know everybody associated with EI Live is thrilled that you are here today. And it's been a personal pleasure for me to help mark Victory in Europe Day with Colonel Len Fullenkamp. So thank you for being our guest today. And let us all take a few moments of silence on May 8th, 2020, and think about those that went before us and how they secured our freedom for 75 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you.